Good evening, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Chris Harrold. I'm the Yara Vita product manager for the UK and Ireland. And today's webinar is all about foliar nutrition of peas and beans. But the principles that we'll talk about during the webinar are just as relevant to any other leguminous crops that you may be growing this season. So what are we going to cover today? Here's the sort of topics that we'd like to go through. We're going to have a few poll questions just to kick off. For any of you who've joined our webinars this year, you'll be familiar with these. They're useful for us, but also I think for yourselves. It just gives us a bit of an overview of what's occurring out there in the crops. And obviously, when you get a season like the one we've been experiencing, it's helpful to us to get an idea of what people's cropping plans are, given that. So we'll go through those. There's just 3 questions, and obviously we'll share the feedback from those questions with you before the end of the webinar. Then we'll go into the basics of pulse nutrition, and I think perhaps we sometimes don't give pulse crops the same attention to crop nutrition that we do other crops, and I think that's because of their obviously their nitrogen fixing ability. We tend to assume that they're okay for their nutrients, but I think if we don't get the basics right, if we start talking about foliar applications, then foliar applications are only going to apply or supply grams of a particular nutrient. We need to make sure that if there's macronutrient requirements for those pulse crops, that we've got that right. And then if we move on to looking how we can improve the performance of pulse crops, again, if we're to get the most out of them, how can we improve that performance? And I'll share with you some information we've had back from tissue analysis of peas and beans over several seasons in pulse crops, and it highlights that really there's a sort of theme running through those samples about particular nutrient deficiencies. So we'll talk about that. And again, in a season like this one, where we've had a lot of rainfall, and some of those nutrients are clearly going to be less available than they perhaps might have been in the soil profile because of that excess rainfall. That's something else we need to take into account in a season like this. Then we'll move on to talk about particular nutrients of pulses, and I'll base that around that tissue analysis data that we've got, and hopefully that'll help focus where we talk about foliar applications of nutrients later on. And then I'll talk about the timing of those, when is the best time to apply them, and when have the best results been seen from those foliar applications. And again, that's going to be important in a season like this, where we're wanting to maximize the investments we're making in all of these crops. And then we'll conclude with our key recommendations. There are a few products in the Yara Vita range that have a place in pulse crops that will supply those key nutrients that we'll have covered. And then at the end, just to finish off, there will be opportunity to have a Q&A session. We have received a few questions prior to the webinar, but if you've got any questions that you want to pose during the webinar, please put those into the chat, and I'll do my best to get those answered in the time that we've got. If we do run out of time towards the end of the session, then I will endeavour to get back to you on an individual basis to answer those questions. Okay, so we'll move on initially then to the poll questions. We've got 3 of those, and I'll set you off with the first one now, and that's: will the SFI legume fallow option, so that's the Sustainable Farming Incentive legume fallow option, be part of your rotations going forward? So if I just hopefully allow you that. You can just take a few moments to consider that one, and then I'll move on to the second one. Use a little bit more time. Okay. Thank you for that. Right, so we'll move on and go to the second one. So this one is, do you use tissue analysis to inform decisions about applying foliar nutrients to your pulse crops? Yes, no, or sometimes. Okay. I think everyone's voted, thank you. And then the last one. Will you apply biostimulants to your pulse crops? Yes, no, or maybe. Great. Thank you, everybody. Right, well, we'll come back to those before we finish, and I'll share the responses we've had back for those. But thank you for that. It's very helpful. So we'll move on. So the basics of pulse crop nutrition. As I said at the start, I think sometimes it's easy to overlook the nutrients required by nitrogen fixing crops like peas and beans if they're to perform well. You know, for successful nitrogen fixation, the crop does require several other key nutrients to help those nodules really maximize that nitrogen fixation, and we'll go on to talk about that in a bit more detail shortly. And also, where soil indices of those key nutrients are good, pulse crops are not always able to access those when needed. You know, during periods of rapid growth, or if the root structure has been compromised due to perhaps poor soil structure, and during periods of drought as well, conditions may mean that crops have less nutrients available. So it's important not to sort of overlook that. And I think, you know, as with any crop, pulse crops require a complete nutrition program, you know, particularly phosphorus and potassium, you know, together with those micronutrients. Otherwise, that nodulation will be reduced, leading to a poorer performance and potential yield reduction. So I think ensuring there's sufficient phosphate and potash in the seed bed is a good start. And I know a lot of growers are now starting to use that approach if they haven't already been doing so. And that interaction that the micronutrients have with those macronutrients is important for various plant functions, not just the effect of, or the function of the nodules. So applying any micronutrients, if we don't get those basics right first, we aren't going to get the best out of those micronutrients and that investment that we're making in the first place. So it's important really to build that crop nutrition strategy right from the outset if we're going to get the best out of these crops. So how do we go about improving the performance of the pulse crops? You know, they do rely heavily on that leguminous nature. You know, the root nodules as a source of nitrogen is important for growth and development. So ensuring that we've got good nodulation and that those nodules survive long enough is absolutely paramount. And this is the whole point around the webinar really. Some essential nutrients are directly required in the metabolism of that rhizobia, and that includes phosphorus, sulphur, magnesium, manganese, boron, and also molybdenum. And we'll talk about all those individually in more detail shortly. And that nitrogen fixing nodule, it's the result of that symbiosis between the crop's roots and the rhizobia, and the bacteria are the engine of the nodules. They fix that atmospheric nitrogen, that N2, and convert it into ammonia that the crop can use as assimilate, can be assimilated in the plant, basically. So obviously the nodules takes a little time to become evident, but once you start to see them, you know that symbiosis or that symbiotic relationship has begun, and it will be supplying, the plant will be supplying the bacteria with carbohydrate from its photosynthetic activity, and in return it gets back that ammonia from the bacteria. And if the nodules are healthy and pink in colour, that's a good indication that everything is functioningly well. If those nodules are grayer in colour, then that would be an indication that things are probably not going as well as they could be. So if we look a little bit deeper into the activity of that rhizobia and where those other elements that I mentioned play their part, the nitrogen fixation, as I say, takes that atmospheric elemental nitrogen and converts it into ammonia. And that requires the nitrogenase enzyme, which is a very complex structure. And that enzyme, it contains those key elements that I've talked about, things like magnesium, molybdenum, sulphur, and iron. And manganese is also important to activate the enzyme. And as the pea and bean crop moves more towards that reproductive stage, it starts producing flowers and then obviously pod set and seed production. As those first seeds start to fill, then the plant can no longer support the demands of the nodules for carbohydrate, and that also of filling the seeds. So it's important to make sure we get all those nutrients in place before the crop gets to that point, in my view. And if we leave it too late, then we've left the crop short, in my view. So it's at that stage that we need to have attention to those nutrients, make sure that the plant continues to photosynthesize effectively with a good healthy green canopy, and make sure that all those key nutrients that we've already touched on are available during that period. And that's where we'll go into a little bit more detail into those individual nutrients. So I said I'd share with you some of the results, well, basically the results that we've had in beans and peas over the last few years into the lab at Pocklington. And you can see here in beans, this particular slide, that 50% of the samples received were low in magnesium, nearly 90% were low in boron, and nearly 70% were also low in molybdenum. There are obviously some other elements there that are showing some deficiency, but I've just picked out the key ones in this case. And if we move on to look at the peas, same period of time basically, not quite as many samples in this case, but same period of time. You can see there's a bit of a trend. Again, around about 50% of those pea samples sent into the lab were showing deficiency in magnesium. About 85% were showing a low level of boron, and manganese showed up in this case just under 40%, showing a low level or very low level, and molybdenum, again, a bit like in the beans, just under 70% were either low or very low in molybdenum. Interestingly, I haven't highlighted it, but you'll see on the chart there that iron was quite low in most of those pea samples as well. I have seen iron deficiency in pea crops, but it seems to be a relatively transient effect. It's a short period of time where the crop expresses that iron deficiency, but then it seems to overcome that. And applications of iron are really unnecessary in my view, particularly on peas. But it is something you sometimes see on particular soil types. So if we now look at those key nutrients that I've just highlighted tend to show up on a regular basis in peas and beans, I'll start with magnesium. Magnesium deficiency in the early stages shows up as areas between the veins showing up as being yellow, and that occurs because magnesium is important in an important component of chlorophyll. That's no different to any other crop. It is important for chlorophyll, we know that. And in the later stages, if you get severe magnesium deficiency, it can actually appear to be early maturity, and we often see that in pulse crops. And if the crop is deficient in magnesium, it impairs the plant's ability to absorb other nutrients, which can lead to secondary nutrient deficiencies. So again, it's a key element, and deficiency can impact yield and also quality. Moving on to boron, as you'll recall from the previous slide showing you the analysis from the samples sent into the lab, boron in peas and beans was shown to be deficient in a lot of samples. And boron deficiency is showing up, I would say, in a lot of crops now, and I think farmers and agronomists are starting to address that in many crops now, and I think pulse crops are no different. It's a very soluble element in the soil, and after the 6-7 months of wet weather that we've just had on certain soil types anyway, you'd have to think that boron availability will be lower than normal, and also it's not very mobile in the plant either. So making sure that there's sufficient boron in the crop, I think, will be an interesting and important area to concentrate on in pulses this year. The symptoms of deficiency can be brittle, hollow and weak stems, which can lead to crops lodging. It's made worse on the sandier soils, the alkaline soils, those low in soil organic matter as well. And it's a key element in those nodules, in their structure and their function. And as you'll have picked up from the start of the webinar, the importance of the nodules and healthy function of those nodules is so important. We know that, and boron is a particularly important component of that good nodule function. Boron's also important for successful pollination. It's important for pod set as well. The other element that showed up as being particularly low in the pea and bean samples was molybdenum. Older and middle leaves can become chlorotic first, and in some instances leaf margins even begin to roll, which is a symptom we see in other crops with molybdenum deficiency, and it can frequently resemble nitrogen deficiency as well. And if it's not available, it directly affects nitrogen metabolism, making plants less efficient at using those available nitrogen resources. It tends to be made worse on acid soils or those low in soil organic matter. And due to the poor mobility of molybdenum within the plant, foliar applications are a good way of helping overcome a molybdenum deficiency within a pulse crop. Also touched on manganese as being an important component of pulse success. Sometimes often related more to crop quality than yield. The deficiency affects peas and beans, but peas can be most affected, especially on higher pH soils. And the reason I mentioned crop quality is around the issue of marsh spot. You get that, or seeds can get that necrotic spot within the middle of them, which was first seen down on Romney Marsh in Kent, hence the name. And that deficiency is linked to the manganese. And it's not just around crop quality for human consumption, that necrotic spot, but it can affect the developing seedlings the following year. So if you were home saving seed, for example, or if the seed crop itself had been deficient in manganese, then that can affect the seed's ability to develop properly the next year. But I would say the main issue is around that human consumption quality aspect. I haven't said too much about sulphur just yet, but we know sulphur deposition from the atmosphere has been declining for many, many years, and a lot of crops are showing response to sulphur applications. Occasionally, that might be applied in the seed bed along with the phosphate and potash that I mentioned earlier. But again, it's an important component not to discount. Yield loss is the main effect, and again, it's very soluble, is sulfate. It leaches readily, and for all the reasons that we've already explained about other nutrient loss due to the rainfall, sulphur availability could well have been affected again this year. So readily available forms of foliar applied sulphur can help overcome a deficiency. So moving on to some of the sort of more minor elements that tend to be seen occasionally in pulse crops. Copper tends to be seen on the older leaves, which turn pale yellow, and the younger leaves show that interveinal chlorosis. Copper is important for leaf development, improved flower set, and also increased yields. Copper availability tends to be lower when pH is above 7. So you get that deficiency on chalk soils, for example. And finally, zinc. Zinc affected plants are again paler in colour than normal and occasionally have a purplish tint. Growth's also reduced due to the effect of zinc on chlorophyll function. And occasionally the internodes can be shortened as well. And deficiency of zinc is exacerbated on organic soils and again high pH soils, and those tending to be higher in available phosphate. So zinc's important for chlorophyll, as I mentioned, but also increased fertility and seed quality as well. So when's the best time to apply foliar nutrients? If we've identified that there's a deficiency, primarily doing those leaf tissue analysis, if you've identified the deficiency, obviously don't wait, get straight on if you can, and rectify that deficiency based on what that analysis is telling you. And we've seen where we've applied micronutrients and then done tissue analysis after that, we tend to see higher levels of nitrogen also in the later growth stages of those crops, which tends to indicate that those foliar applied nutrients have helped nodule health and therefore improve the uptake of nitrogen. As I've already mentioned, a successful crop nutrition strategy should ensure adequate supplies of phosphorus and potassium to enable nodule development, and those foliar applications are sort of a follow-on from that initial getting the basics right. So foliar applications of sulphur, magnesium, manganese, molybdenum and boron can help ensure that efficient canopy and flowering process. So when's the best time to apply those micronutrients? Well, from work done in trials by various organisations, more consistent results have been seen where the applications are made earlier in the season. As I mentioned, as the crop moves more towards that sort of reproductive stage, flowering and pod set, the plant struggles to cope with the demands of the nodules and the carbohydrates needed to fill the seeds. So we mustn't let that sort of situation arise, and I think it's important to make sure that we've got the crop sufficiently loaded up with those nutrients to make sure that it carries it through that period. And the more consistent results have been seen from those earlier applications in the season, so sort of from the 4 nodes onwards up to the start of flowering. When we've applied those nutrients later on, sort of from pod fill onwards, it's almost too late. The benefit of those applications seems to be less effective, if you like. So moving on to products that we have in the Yara Vita range that could have a place this spring in your pulse crops. The first one would be Foliar Pro. It's a high quality, fully soluble powder containing a balanced combination of the essential nutrients that we've been talking about in the first half of the webinar. It's easy to mix, very safe on the leaf, and has a good tank mixability to be applied with other agrochemical applications. So you'll see from the analysis there, it contains sulphur, boron, magnesium, manganese, and some molybdenum, and it comes in a 10 kilo pack. It used to be available in 20 kilo packs, but they're no longer available. It's just available in 10 kilo packs now. And our core recommendation for peas and beans would be to apply 3 kilos to the hectare of Foliar Pro as early in the season as possible, provided there's obviously enough leaf cover to intercept the spray. So I would suggest from that sort of 4th node onwards. And repeat applications can be made if you're in a particularly deficient situation, up to, I would say, the flowering stage, to get the full benefit of making those applications in the crop itself. If you've got a more, or you've done your tissue analysis and you've got a more sort of specific requirement, you've identified you've got deficiency, particularly with manganese or copper or zinc, or a combination of the 3, then Yara Vita Mancozin would be probably more appropriate. It's a high concentrated liquid formulation containing those elements. Again, easy to mix and safe on the crop, and a good tank mixability as well. That comes in a 5 litre pack, and our core recommendation for peas and beans would be to apply 1 litre to the hectare. Same growth stages basically as I mentioned for the Foliar Pro, basically from the 4th node onwards up to the beginning of flowering. One product I want to talk about here because I think it is relevant. It's not currently available commercially, but we have got it in replicated trials this year in the UK, and that's Yara Amplix Flostrel. Flostrel is a product that contains a biostimulant, seaweed-based biostimulant, but also some boron and phosphate. And the seaweed element brings auxins, cytokinin, gibberellins, and other growth regulators, and they all help promote flower number, and seed development. So this product, it's a combination, as I say, of biostimulant and nutrient, and our recommendation is to apply 1 litre to the hectare at the same time as we've said about the previous 2 products. As I say, it's in replicated trial work here in the UK this year, and hopefully we'll have some data to share with you later on in the year ahead of potentially being available for use in 2025. So if you would sort of put them into a sort of staged approach, as I've just mentioned, the Flostrel isn't available yet, but it hopefully will be available next year with the data to back it up. But at the moment, the key products in the range are Manganese and Foliar Pro, and I think pick the product that fits for your situation, and the analysis that you've got back from the lab based on that tissue analysis, and apply those products as you see the benefit as you go through the season. So the final messages before we get on to sharing the results of the poll and answering some questions. I think the key is to make sure we get those basics right. As I said at the start, placement of P and K fertilizer I think is important to give the crop a best start. And then we've got those products there as options. The Yara Vita Manganese at 1 litre to the hectare applies manganese, copper and zinc when the crop needs it most. And the Foliar Pro has got all those nutrients that we mentioned that are key to a successful pulse crop and keeping the nodules healthy right from the outset. And the Flostrel, as I mentioned, hopefully we'll have some more data to help make decisions about that product next year. But that brings me to the end. As I say, thank you very much for taking the time to join this evening. I hope you found it of some use, and it just leaves me to say enjoy the rest of your evenings, and wishing you success with your pulse crops this year. Thank you very much.